Beatrice's father was the Dean of Art History at the University of Austria in Salzburg. His most popular classes were on the Goths, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. But personally, he enjoyed modern art. He was quite esteemed within his department and among his students. Professor Landau was a patron of the arts as well, often bringing home struggling young painters so that they could enjoy a hot meal before taking to the streets. Beatrice grew up in a large house not far from the university, with these scruffy and serious young men loitering nearby. She loved to listen to their conversations, often lingering in doorways and fetching them hot tea and mandelbrot. Her mother was a sociable woman, busy about the house, and her brother had his own friends, but Beatrice liked to be in her father's study, hearing the boys talk about beautiful women and mad painters and the vital world of art. She was a daddy's girl who worshipped her father all her life. Her later memories of Austria were focused on her father and his students, wearing their corduroy and tweed and scuffed shoes, gathered about the bewhiskered Victor Landau in his study. She dreamed, even decades later, about the courtyard and the lively parties the Landaus used to host there. Before the Anschluss, before everything was taken from them, before her mother and brother left, before she and her father were forced to leave their home and country. The Landaus were not particularly religious. They owned a menorah and a mezuzah, but their social circle included Catholics, socialists, atheists, and one Zionist who was strangely silent during the Anschluss and disappeared within 6 weeks. Most of those in their social circle were not religious people, who were apolitical in fact. Beatrice's mother, Judith Lederer Landau, was raised in an affluent home in Vienna as the daughter of a prosperous rug merchant who traveled Europe and the Near East. Judith had 2 older and 1 younger sister, who later emigrated to Montreal, Canada. Judith was charming and well-bred, and she could have had her choice of suitors, yet she was drawn to the intelligentsia, and so she married a poor art teacher. Only through her prodding did Victor ascend to position of dean. Through his salary and a sizable inheritance after her father died, the Landaus were able to purchase a 3-story home in a good neighborhood. They were lively people. Victor was a great debater and philosopher. He had a warm sense of humor, and he prized the minds and passion and openness of young people. Judith was welcoming, and she loved to entertain and flirt. They were forever attempting to impress various university administrators, local politicians, and benefactors to raise funds and bring new talent into the community. The house was quite dignified and grand, although a bit dated by the early 1930s. Books were piled pell-mell into ornate built-in mahogany shelving. Tables were covered with lace and tapestries. A few cherubic field mice wandered in from the courtyard, scuttering about when company came to call. The manor had seen much in its 100-year history, including the 15 years that the Landaus made it their home. They knew their neighbors well. They included a prominent chemist, 2 haberdashers, a droll botanist, a female gynecologist and her husband, a city official. There was an opera singer and an elderly rabbi, a world-class skier, and a photographer specializing in nude, very saftige housewives. They shopped at the same stores, rode the tram together, entertained at one another's homes. The Landaus considered themselves Salzburgians first, intellectuals second, and Jews, well, mainly on the Sabbath. All of that came to an end when the Nazis arrived. It was as though a thunderbolt suddenly crashed from the skies and split the Landaus from everyone else. The rabbi was the first of their neighbors to depart the city, heading into Switzerland, where a granddaughter resided. The haberdasher, well into his 60s, was beaten on the street in front of the neighborhood tavern. The photographer went to stay with friends, first in Habsburg and later near the Italian border. before committing suicide in 1941. Victor was advised on April 1st to abstain from teaching his classes, but he continued to show up at the university for the next 6 weeks. This despite receiving several death threats. He did curtail his activities only after Judith derided him for putting his students in danger. All summer, he drove his family crazy. It infuriated Judith that he couldn't see what was happening to their homeland. His disregard for his safety tormented her at night. For Wilhelm, having his father home every day was constraining. Victor demanded to be entertained, and Wilhelm had no patience for his father. Beatrice desperately tried to make Victor happy, cooking croque monsieur and soft-boiled eggs for him, but secretly wishing that she were a boy who could just sit in their study and talk with Papa about all the meaningful things that men discuss together. Meanwhile, their funds were dwindling, their neighbors had disappeared or were avoiding the Landaus, and it became too risky to venture outside other than quick trips to market. Usually Wilhelm ran those errands. He was furtive and returned breathless each time. After a few of those visits, however, Wilhelm was ready to get the hell out of Austria, and he and his mama conspired together to make their move. Judith's sister in Canada kept cabling them, urging the Landaus to book passage immediately out of Europe. Judith begged her husband every night, wringing her hands together in desperation. They must leave together at once. But Victor was insistent that this too would pass. The Germans were simply trying to frighten everyone, he informed her. They needed to make a show of force. This was all part of a plan to bring better economic opportunities, and once they succeeded, the Germans would focus on Vienna and not pretty little Salzburg, with its old Baroque buildings and symphonies, and a Jewish population that dated back to the 1300s. If they left, they would lose their home and everything in it. Couldn't she see that? He shook his head, unwaveringly. He knew that he would return to teaching, if not in the fall, then certainly by the start of the New Year's session. Judith and Wilhelm argued with Victor until they were blue in the face. He, in turn, became passive and silent. When a home was burned to the ground with an elderly Jewish woman in it, 4 blocks from theirs that September, this was the last straw. Judith decided to ransom her husband into leaving. In an act of desperation, Judith decided she would leave and take the children with her. She purchased 4 tickets to North America, believing that at the last moment, the fear of being separated from his family would coerce Victor into joining her plans. When Judith returned home with her tickets, not only did Victor shake his head and retreat into the bedroom, slamming the door, but then Beatrice went into a screaming fit. She would not be separated from her papa. Not knowing what else to do, but believing that her husband would make the right decision if his back was against the wall, Judith packed her bags and Wilhelm's. She announced to her family that they were taking the train to Brest, France, and onward by ship to North America. You and Beatrice are to follow us when you are ready. I have purchased fare for you, and you can exchange it when you are ready. It is all paid. You must leave. She and Wilhelm departed the next morning. With every passing step away from the house, Judith turned back in hope that her full family would join her. Neither Victor nor Beatrice budged, however. Judith marched on. She believed that, at the very least, in her absence, her daughter would see to reason. For the next few months, Beatrice and Victor were alone in the house. The marble sconces at their front steps were stolen. They woke one morning to find a swastika painted on the front picture window. Occasionally, Victor tried to meet up with some of his fellow academics to see if there might be work as a private tutor or transcriber. He often forgot, however, to tell his daughter when he was leaving. Beatrice cooked, kept the house tidy, and washed their clothes. She was perfectly fine staying at home. Let Mother and Wilhelm go off to Canada. She and Papa were happy together. Like her father, she did not see what was happening until it could no longer be denied. She came home once to find their house ransacked, and believing that someone broke in and looted them, became terrified after that to leave. Unbeknownst to her, It was her own father who tore through his study and all his paperwork, a man possessed and no longer cognizant of reality. The charwoman stopped coming months ago, and Beatrice began to let the garden go to seed. She passively swept up fronds of dry foliage, dead roses that had blown around the courtyard. Birds no longer even visited the property with their cheerful songs. When it became too dodgy for anyone to venture out for even a simple errand, their neighbor, a kind Bavarian woman with a mentally challenged son, went to market for Beatrice. Yet the money was running low. Her father was of no help, although Beatrice was grateful to have him safely home. Occasionally he still snuck out, and when she discovered this, she went purple with fear. Chastised, he promised he would stay home and behave. "I will work on the book, dear one," he swore. He was writing a biography of Ferrer Bassa, the Spanish Gothic painter who, like his son, would die of the plague. Victor didn't accomplish much, however. Some days Beatrice found her father in his bathrobe, pacing barefoot in the remnants of the courtyard garden, weeping and raging at the skies. "The sadists," he shouted to no one, "will burn all of culture as we know it." A few times she found Papa nipping at the brandies, and once she walked in on Victor in the parlor, throwing his wedding picture into the fire. She extricated it with a fire iron, but it was badly burned and unsalvageable. Finally, at the start of 39, he agreed to leave Austria and take his frightened daughter with him. They grieved together the loss of their beloved home, but Beatrice now felt ready to embrace a new future and relieved to be traveling with her papa. The letters from Judith talked glowingly about Hawkesbury, the little town near Montreal where she and Wilhelm were staying. Papa left the house on a Monday morning to go to the visa office to get their travel papers stamped, and was turned away 3 times in a single day. Beatrice waited at home, pacing and biting inside her lip for Victor to return. Doggedly, he made his way home at dusk, with their visas stamped for transport, the 2 new ship tickets with dates for a week later, and an ugly bruise at his temple. "Papa," she cried, "who did this to you?" His reply, forlorn and foreboding, was Austria. He explained that he had to wire the Chinese consulate in Vienna, of all things, for help. They were the only ones who would vouch for father and daughter to depart the country of their birth, the land where their ancestors had worshipped and paid taxes and cultivated strong creative communities. Beatrice looked at the papers her father handed her. How strange that a little slip of paper, with a stamp from a clerk born halfway around the world, was their ticket to a new life. They packed their belongings on a bleak and misty January weekend. Papa did not seem to care what he took. He packed his shave kit and an extra suit, some underclothes, socks, and cufflinks. Beatrice gathered his notes from the past 3 years on the book about Bassa and rolled them into a cylinder which she tied at the side of her valise. She hoped that someday Victor would resume with vigor to his writing. She packed clothing for herself and some bread and a jar of custard and jam from the neighbor lady for the journey. She also kept one photograph, a portrait of her at the age of 6, standing beside Papa as he sat on a tapestry chair. She taped the photograph into her valise so it would not be damaged. Their ship was departing from north of Rotterdam. They boarded the train in Salzburg for Innsbruck. From there, they traveled to Basel, Switzerland, and then Metz, France. They walked more than 4 miles to cross into Belgium when the train was taken out of commission for a coal strike, and at long last they made their way north into the Netherlands. At each stop, at every crossing, Beatrice watched her father slump farther and farther down in his seat, weary and dejected, but when she caught his eye, he grimaced slightly. They boarded the ocean liner, the Mariana. Traveling in 3rd class, they were encouraged to find other Austrians in their stateroom. Good people. All of the 3rd class passengers were thrilled to be on board, Jews and others eager to flee the cauldron of Europe. They were scheduled to land in New York and pass through customs a week later, Beatrice and Victor would take a train north the following morning through the Adirondacks of New York State into Canada. There, Judith and Wilhelm awaited father and daughter. Beatrice lay in her berth at night and imagined a beautiful jazz-age Manhattan skyline, bejeweled and bewitching, awaiting her. She pictured ladies in fine ivory silks and gentlemen in black tuxedos strolling down the pavement, tipping their top hats. She was only casually curious about Canada. Mama wrote fondly of their neighborhood, which she called a suburb. Wilhelm secured work at a machine shop, and he and Mama had their own apartment, Judith wrote. Papa seemed unwell during the journey, brooding and lethargic. He complained that the food was unappetizing. It was, and the sleeping quarters uncomfortable and degrading. Each night Beatrice helped Victor to bed, and was increasingly puzzled and alarmed by his frail state. He looked unkempt and grizzled, his cheeks hollowed in. She tried to help him shave. Papa, it won't do to frighten the Americans when we land. They are expecting us to greet them in style, as they will welcome us. Victor only nodded, his fingers trembling with the razor blade as it scoured away his graying bristles. On a Saturday afternoon, 2 days before their planned arrival in New York, they were on deck resting and drinking Turkish coffee. Victor sat up in his deck chair, started to rise suddenly, gasped, and fell to the ground. Beatrice shrieked, panicked, and darted to her father's side. Other passengers and crew rushed over. Within 20-30 seconds, his heart stopped beating, and Victor Landau was pronounced deceased. Beatrice was lightheaded and stunned. She clutched his hand and held it to her chest. "Oh, Papa," she cried out in vain. They took his body from her and whisked it away to be washed and embalmed and placed in a pauper's wooden coffin in ice storage. Ships had coffins, Beatrice learned that day. This was not an exceptional event. The ship doctor informed her that it was quite fortunate that her father died of natural causes, and that the ship was so close to arrival. If Victor had had an infectious disease, or they were much farther away, he might have been buried at sea. At least she could take Papa to have a proper Hebrew funeral once in New York. 2 middle-aged Dutch sisters traveling together came to her aid. "Sister, let us help you." They sat with her and called for tea and biscuits. She would not eat, but did take a few sips of the strong black tea. The women escorted her back to her cabin and lit the lantern so that she would not be in darkness. One sister stayed with Beatrice, and the other went to find the Landau's cabin mates to share the sad news. Arrangements were made, and Beatrice was given the room to herself that night. She wept through to morning. At dawn, a knock upon the door produced the captain's aide, who inquired about her well-being. He informed her that Victor had been prepared for burial. He handed her a printed list of funeral homes in New York City and asked her to select one. The following afternoon they arrived at Ellis Island. Beatrice was in her cabin and did not see the Grand Lady of Liberty welcoming her. She approached customs, was questioned, and her visa stamped. The agent, an Italian woman with wire glasses, told her that the ferry would escort her and her cargo to the docks. The kind Dutch sisters were continuing by ship to Baltimore, where they would be working at a bakery, and she wasn't able to thank the women or say goodbye. The captain's aide quickly wheeled the coffin out, pressing the necessary papers into the custom agent's hand. "That will be $10, the agent informed Beatrice. The charges were for the coffin and the preparation, along with storage of the body for 2 days. Beatrice stood on the dock alone after the ferry released her and the other departees. She had to wait for another porter to come and assist her with getting the coffin to the funeral home, 4 blocks from the wharf, and her baggage. Her train to Montreal did not set off until the next morning, and she and Papa planned to book a hotel for the night. She had her money and Papa's money after paying the customs agent. That left only $39. She would need to tip the porter, who finally showed up with a cart on 4 wheels. The coffin was placed at the bottom, and the luggage on the rack above. A rope was attached for the porter to pull. They nodded at each other and began to walk. The man, a glum, balding man around 30, swung the heavy cart left and right as they made their way up the streets. Beatrice carried her valise and her father's valise and his papers. It was all suddenly too much for her. Tears began welling up in her eyes as they passed a stinking outdoor fish market. The boys were dressed in white smocks, crusted with smears of ugly brown blood, and they shouted the names of fish above her head. Carp, swordie, best bass from the Atlantic, mussels, mussels, flounder, flounder. A very young woman around Beatrice's age stood at a rickety corner stand selling pretzels, long pretzels, like sticks with crystallized salt. Beatrice looked at the cart, hungry, and began to walk toward it. Girlie, keep that corpse away from here, the lady bawled at her and pushed her in the chest. Beatrice stumbled but managed to stay on her feet. It took 15 minutes for the porter to drag the coffin inch by inch farther from the port. The man never spoke. Beatrice sobbed. People rushed by them clumsily, dismayed by their terrible cargo and the way that she appeared. Finally, a priest came to her aid. Child, may I be of assistance? She began crying loudly, and the porter stopped and angrily sighed. She explained to the priest about her father's death and that his coffin was en route to the mortuary, but she did not know where to go for the night. He patted her hand, reassuring her. Do you have money for a room? She explained yes, but not more than a few dollars, because the ship took so much money for the coffin and for preparing her father and for the cart. The priest recommended a place nearby that would not cost her much. It wasn't a place that he would normally recommend for a young lady, he explained, but it would be safe for one night. He walked with them, and finally they arrived at the funeral home. She had to leave, Papa. The priest held her hand as the porter took one last trudging hoist at the rope and cart and disappeared into the alley. They waited for him to return, without the coffin, but with her luggage. He shoved the cart at them and ducked away. The priest and the distressed young woman continued 3 blocks north and 1 block west to a 3-story hotel. The lobby was forlorn and the rugs were threadbare. A chandelier hung above the lobby as though this were once a grand place, but it was now dusty, and half of the lights were dim or dark. The priest summoned the manager and helped the frightened girl explain her situation. The manager was a tired-looking man with a dark complexion. He looked at Beatrice with a nauseated look as he explained that he could rent her a room for $3 for the night. She just nodded with relief and exhaustion. The manager snapped his fingers and called a bellhop over to assist her. A Negro boy, not much younger than she, rushed over to unload the cases from the ship's cart and place them on his own. The priest asked the hotel porter, "Will you help the young lady to her room?" The boy nodded without a word. "And accompany her to the train station in the morning. I'll give you this for your trouble." And he gave the lad a 50-cent piece. The boy, mouth wide open, nodded his head and palmed the coin. "Show enough, Father," he retorted. Beatrice thanked the priest profusely for his assistance. "Take care, my dear. Stay safe," he soothed, patting her on the shoulder and departing. Beatrice and the bellboy walked to the service elevator, dragging the loaded cart along the hall. It snagged on the balding carpet, a sad replica of a Persian runner. At the 3rd floor, the bellboy opened the door to the room and allowed Beatrice to step before him. She entered slowly, cautiously. It was a poor apartment with a sagging bed covered in a bedspread that must have once been white. A corner cabinet stood nearby for clothes to be hung, and a water pitcher, stained and chipped, sat upon the nightstand. A narrow window provided the only natural light, peering into a filthy alley where little children ran barefoot, and far above, laundry was strung across a balcony in the adjacent building. Beatrice felt horrified. She asked for the WC, and the boy pointed to the opposite end of the hallway. The space she found herself in was tiny, and the wallpaper was gouged, perhaps with a pencil. Dull light shone through the crack under the door. She whispered, "Thank you," and the bellboy darted away as fast as can be. She was afraid to leave the room, but several hours since she departed the ship, and her bladder now full, she must. She raced down the hall, taking the water pitcher with her. She used the WC and brought back water. There was an old washcloth on the nightstand, and she used the water to dampen it. She stripped off her sweater and undershirt and wiped away the last few days of sweat and grit and stress. She slowly unlaced her black shoes and massaged the soles of her throbbing, stockinged feet. She climbed into the bed. It was still early evening, and she hadn't eaten all day, but she was so terrified and too exhausted to step out of the room again. She closed her eyes and began to drift off. It was to be a long and horrifying night. She woke to a punching sound around midnight coming from above her. Nearly a minute passed before she realized, with disgust, what it was. The sounds of intercourse in the room over hers. It went on, and she sobbed in distress. No sooner did it stop and she began to fall asleep, but then it came again, this time from the room opposite. My God, she thought, this is a place for prostitutes. Now she knew why the priest cautioned that this was not the best place for a decent lady. She got very little sleep. Once she dreamt that her father stood at the foot of her bed, and she jumped, awakened in terror. Beatrice awoke at the earliest hint of morning sunlight, with 5 hours to go before the train was to depart. Still, she could not sleep. Perhaps she might be able to rest aboard the train. She utterly forgot her glittering dreams of Manhattan. She wanted to get out of this depraved city. She wiped her face and put on her sweater and shoes. Leaving her belongings in the room, she braved her way to the elevator. It was still early morning, but there were several people mingling around the lobby. There she found a tray of coffee and oranges. She grabbed at them. A woman, old, ugly, her hair dyed a garish red with white at the roots, chastised her. "Don't you take it all, you pig." But Beatrice did not care. She stuffed 2 oranges into her pockets and drank the coffee in one long gulp. She asked about the bellboy and was told he wouldn't start his shift for 2 more hours. She spied an overstuffed settee near the front window and sat down, dejected, peeling an orange. A man wearing a fur coat slid beside her. "What's your name, beautiful?" Beatrice pretended that she spoke no English. "Come on, don't give out on me." He grabbed her elbow, and she gave a little cry. "Leave the girl alone!" cried the red-headed whore, and Beatrice ran into the stairwell, scurrying back to her room. She lay on the bed and began weeping, terrible weeping that went on, hoarse and painful. She heard a mean voice through the vent grumble, "Knock that off, goddamn!" Unable to stop, she stifled her cries into the pillow. Mercifully, she drifted asleep again and was awakened much later by a knock. It was the Negro bellboy. "Morning, miss," he greeted her, and trundled over to get her valise. They passed through the shoddy hallway into the dilapidated elevator to the lobby. Mr. Furcoat was still there. Beatrice saw him talking up another woman, a chubby woman who completely ignored him. The bellboy and Beatrice stepped out the double doors of the hotel. No one spoke a word to either. Beatrice clutched both valises to her chest and stared at the ground. She simply followed the boy's shoes as he carried her other luggage along the sidewalk. She noticed a hole in the sole of his left shoe and took pity on him. It took the pair almost 30 long minutes to walk the distance to the train station, and the boy never spoke a word. Buggies rumbled by. An Oriental lady stopped right on the street and stared, then shouted something that sounded like clink, dink, doink, dodo. Someone threw a tomato down from a window high above the pair, hitting Beatrice's shoulder. It was colder outside than the day before, and Beatrice shuddered as she rushed to follow the boy. She remained silent, but tears flowed down her cheeks. She heard voices, screaming, shrieking, and laughing. The bellboy turned around once and looked at her. He smiled as if to tell her, "It's okay," and they raced on. They arrived at the Canal Street train station around 10 that morning. Beatrice was a soggy mess, with wet streaks down her face and the front of her sweater splashed with tomato. The bellboy found a train attendant who helped Beatrice purchase her ticket and told her where she could send a wire to her family. At the last minute, she turned to the boy, and thinking of his shoe and his kindness, reached into her dwindling money and gave him another $1 on top of the 50-cent piece he received from the priest. The adolescent stared at the bill, tucked it into the front pocket of his slacks, whispered, "Thank you," and disappeared. It was another 45-minute wait for the train. She wandered away from the station in search of food. She still had one orange in her pocket, but hoped to save that for later. She discovered a little corner restaurant selling triangles of bread with cheese. "Pizza!" they cried, and she tried a slice of New York-style pizza pie. She felt moderately good for the first time in a week. She boarded the train and was disappointed to see that every seat was filled and she could not be seated alone as she wished. She found a place beside an old woman with crazy whiskers on her chin. The woman fell asleep the moment they took off and snored like a deranged mule. Beatrice listened around her, unable to discern the many languages of the other passengers. There were dark-skinned people who spoke in a series of cliques. There were Ukrainian men, thick and mustachioed. A woman with a red dot painted on her forehead was in the row across from Beatrice. She was wrapped in yards of fine green silk, the bottom edges soiled and tattered. 4 little children piled on the seat beside their mum, all wearing short pants and sandals despite the cold. Suddenly Beatrice realized that she forgot to send the wire. She forgot to warn Mama about Papa. But the train was slowly pulling out of the station now. There was nothing she could do. Beatrice was keyed up and could not sleep for several hours, despite the many snoring and snoozing people around her. The Ukrainians kept eyeballing her, and finally she pretended to be asleep. But once the train was well outside the city, it was just too pretty not to look out the windows. A man came by around 1 that afternoon, selling bologna sandwiches. Beatrice bought one and ate it with her remaining orange. The landscape passed and changed, and every hour they made another stop. One by one, passengers stepped off the train, and occasionally someone else got on. By 5 o'clock that evening, Beatrice was one of only a dozen travelers remaining in her car. It was more than a 10-hour journey from New York City to Montreal, Canada. The train emptied out at Syracuse in the afternoon, and Beatrice quickly boarded another train to continue to Montreal. From her window, she could see college students walking near the station, wearing their berets and colorful wool coats. Oh, how she longed to be one of them, a 17-year-old student, carefree and idealistic. Frightened, her beloved father dead, she'd endured a harrowing experience. But some small sliver of her mind remembered that right now, she was in America, free of Nazi tyranny, healthy and young. It would be weeks before she was able to smile again, but that evening, on board the final leg of her trip, she finally breathed a sigh of relief. It was midnight when the train roared into Montreal. Mama and Wilhelm were waiting there for her, sleepy and excited, along with Mama's brother-in-law, who drove them to the station. Now Beatrice had to explain where Papa was. Mama was bereft, broken. Wilhelm cried out angrily. He'd been so close to freedom. Neither seemed relieved to see Beatrice, or showed any concern for what she had endured. As they rode to their home in silence, Beatrice only wanted to sleep, to bathe and to sleep. When they arrived, she was disappointed to see that their apartment was very meager. They lived in a 2-room flat above a garment maker's shop. Wilhelm slept on a cot near the closet. Beatrice was to sleep on a rolled-up mattress on the kitchen floor. Mama offered to let Beatrice sleep with her, but the notion of resting in her father's place horrified her. They received a wire a week later, letting them know that Papa was buried at a Hebrew cemetery in Manhattan. Beatrice ached, not being able to lay stones at his grave. She continued to secretly suffer from night terrors, even hearing Papa's voice calling to her. She rarely ventured from the apartment those first few weeks. She worried that she might be going crazy. She knew that she'd never know how to tell anyone what she experienced, and she never did. Judith sent her to Aunt Karina's, a 3-mile round-trip walk every few days. She should have registered for school, but Mama wasn't working, and Wilhelm's income was barely enough to pay the rent. Papa would have found work teaching. Not quite at the level that Victor was used to, of course, but it would have covered their bills. Now everyone needed to work, and that included Beatrice. So Mama sent Beatrice to her aunt and uncle's apartment several days a week to clean, and her aunt would ask her friends who else needed their houses cleaned. She usually made $2 a week. Sometimes Uncle Bernard bought the family groceries instead. Mama took in some needlepoint for extra pocket money. That summer, Beatrice took a second job at a sandwich shop in Montreal and rode the train into the city. She took the job so she could pay for art classes. She loved her studies and hoped that someday she might be able to attend university and study fine art. Almost 3 months after her arrival, Mama met a man named Alfred, a salesman. Mama always sent Beatrice and Wilhelm outside the flat when Alfred came to visit. Beatrice was disgusted that her mother took up so soon with another man. Her husband was barely cold in his grave. Beatrice didn't express her anger, however. It bottled up inside of her. Soon thereafter, Aunt Karina and Uncle Bernard moved to Toronto, and she found herself picking up more restaurant shifts. At least there she met some girlfriends around her age. Mama and Alfred would have dreadful fights, and Beatrice suspected that he was two-timing Judith. Mama would cry when Alfred left, and frequently Mama sported a bruise on her wrist. But when Beatrice asked about it, Mama would claim that she injured herself. Foolish woman. Beatrice held the picture of herself with Papa close, sometimes sleeping with it under her pillow. Finally, noticing that it began to wear from her fingerprints, she saved 30 cents and bought a glass frame to protect it. Alfred and Mama had a 3-hour argument one night, and Alfred pushed Mama down the steps. He threatened to cut her and had a big slicing knife for fish that he wielded. He did not cut Mama. He cut Wilhelm instead on the forearm, who then pushed Alfred back. Alfred chased the three from their flat, locked the Landaus out, and burned Mama's nice coat in their stove. A neighbor let the Landaus stay with her for the night. The family decided to move the next morning, and when Alfred slipped out to go to work, they ran inside and gathered their belongings. They hitched a ride with a goat farmer to Toronto, where he planned to sell a couple of kids. There, they settled into a small and dilapidated cottage on the outskirts of town. For a while, things were looking up. Mama got a job helping a seamstress who made school uniforms. Beatrice worked at a department store as a restocker late at night, and Wilhelm worked in a warehouse. Beatrice found another art class and put down a deposit to enroll. Then Wilhelm got in trouble. He was arrested, and Mama sold some of their belongings to get him out of jail. Aunt Karina and Uncle Bernard were disgusted and wanted nothing more to do with them. Wilhelm was a bad influence on their own boys. Wilhelm was told to get out of the city by the police, and Mama couldn't let her boy go alone. So all 3 of the Landaus took the train to Windsor and came across the Ambassador Bridge to Detroit, finding a tiny apartment to rent near Grand Boulevard. During her first months in Detroit, Beatrice continued to suffer the effects from her experience in transit the year before. She strangely acted out the experiences of the aftermath of her father's death. She would isolate herself in her room. She hoarded oranges, finding the smell comforting. She could not sense when they became putrid, and Judith would root them out of hiding under her daughter's bed. Beatrice would occasionally wake during the night to the specter of her father at the foot of her bed. She never breathed a word of this to anyone. But after 6 months in their new home, the young woman started to come alive. Her brother stayed out of trouble. He worked as a delivery boy for a deli. Mama worked the graveyard shift at the Verner's bottling plant. Judith insisted that Beatrice focus on her art studies and discouraged her daughter from taking a job. Beatrice enrolled in session after session, including a class for nude sketches that made her blush up to her earlobes. The family made friends in their neighborhood. Mama made huge batches of chicken soup, and all the neighbors would come over and bring a potluck dish. Mrs. Weintraub baked the most delicious apricot rugula, and the widow Poltz made gefilte fish. She bought the fish days in advance and let them swim around her bathtub, then prepared the fish balls on her balcony on a little metal table. The entire block smelled of white fish and pickerel, but the gefilte fish was delicious and spicy, with little bits of carrot tucked inside. Beatrice met a couple of girls in her class, and they invited her to join them at the dance hall near the Masonic Temple Theater on Saturday nights. Her girlfriends were on the prowl for a man, and the three always had a jolly time. Beatrice was still very shy. Annie was quite plain and had a potato sack body, but she could dance like a Corinne and was funny and charming with all the boys. Sarah sported a model's body and beautiful honey-colored hair, but her tongue was barbed and she could be mean-spirited with the boys. Nevertheless, her dance card was always filled before Annie's or Beatrice's. Beatrice would order pink lemonade and let her curly hair go natural, wrapped up in an aubergine band she sewed herself, adorned with a goose feather. She could dance the Balboa and the St. Louis shag better than her girlfriends. She'd just turned 19. It was late 1940, and the troubles in Europe were the last thing on her mind. She dreamed of Austria, though, its parks and rivers, her home and the gardens in their neighborhood. She harbored no nostalgia for her former countrymen, however, and was in no way patriotic. She despised the Austrians for turning her family out, betraying its citizens. She blamed the Austrians, not the Nazis or the Germans, for the mess her family went through. She met Michael Ashner through her brother on New Year's Eve. Michael was not too tall, very dapper, and had a solemn and attentive air about him. He became a welcome distraction in her life. She appreciated his smile and his calm demeanor. Michael was affectionate with her and respectful to her mother. They dated casually for a month, seriously for 6 months. On Labor Day weekend, Beatrice accepted Michael's proposal of marriage. She understood that his business dealings were questionable, as her brother's were. She wasn't comfortable with that knowledge, but she never asked Michael about it. She believed that he yearned for a better life, and this was what people like them needed to do in America, as immigrants, to survive. Their marriage was never perfect. The difficult years when he was in prison, when he was often gone, when there was danger, and the loss of the babies. When Solomon was born, perfectly healthy, Beatrice should have softened, and she did, but not enough. Granddaughters really brought the first sense of pure joy into her life. Beatrice was affectionate with both girls, but after a while, Eva began to scare her. She associated Eva's strange behavior with her own difficulties after her father's death. She tried not to think of that awful experience coming into New York. She thought she had gone mad. She was never able to recognize that she had simply been grieving, that she was depressed, frightened, and exhausted during her ordeal on the ship and in New York City. Beatrice felt that something was really wrong with herself, and she thought about those months before she and her father left Austria, recalling Victor's strange behavior. She wondered if perhaps he'd been insane as well. When her son was born, her guard went up, watching for signs of illness in her boy, and thankfully never discovering it. Lena, too, was calm and easy-natured, and Beatrice believed they were out of the woods. Then Eva came along, and a sense of danger and disgracefulness overcame Beatrice. She had passed this curse on to another generation. It didn't help that her second granddaughter was the spitting image of herself at that age. Nobody else saw it that early on, because Beatrice possessed only one photograph of herself as a child, the picture with her father when she was so young. While Eva was seeing specialists and Saul and Irene were trying to figure out what was wrong with their daughter, Beatrice was entering menopause. No one knew anything about it, not about her going through the change, nor about the blackouts she began to suffer. Her anxiety was a manifestation of her fears about her granddaughter and feeling responsible if Eva was mentally ill. Like everything else connected to Beatrice's health, it was all cloaked in shame and utter secrecy. Judith died the year before Eva was born. One afternoon, a few years later, Beatrice went to pay respects at her mother's grave. Driving her blue Bel Air, she suddenly found herself on the wrong side of town. She didn't even remember driving. She came to as she plowed through a red light into someone's front yard. A Chaldean woman came screeching out, shaking her fist at the sight of her ruined petunias. The Bel Air came to a stop at the foot of a maple tree, and Beatrice had a gash across her left temple. She was bewildered, terrified that the woman was going to pummel her with both fists. The driver's side window was cracked open, and as the woman shouted at her, Beatrice put both hands in front of her face and whimpered in fear. New neighbors also came running out to see what the fuss was. They easily recognized that Beatrice was not quite herself and pulled the shouting woman outside the car back by her shoulders. Beatrice was obviously not drunk and hadn't intended to drive skid marks up the lawn into a tree. The homeowner finally calmed down, took mercy on the frightened driver, and asked her neighbor to call the paramedics and the police. Beatrice told the officer that she couldn't see, which was the closest to the truth that she could verbalize. He presumed that her vision got blurry and that this obviously well-off woman wasn't at fault. She only needed a few stitches and a good optometrist. He also noted the name Ashner on her driver's license and concluded that he didn't need to make a stink by issuing her a ticket. Beatrice was treated in the emergency room at Sinai, and Poppy came from work to pick her up. He seemed more angry than worried, but still insisted that she see their doctor for a thorough checkup. She admitted to Dr. Rosenbaum that her sight was fine, but that she was distracted and lost awareness the day of the accident. She also revealed that it was a year since her last cycle. Dr. Rosenbaum prescribed Premarin, which usually did some good. There would always be so much fear and anger bottled up inside of Beatrice Landau Ashner, but the meds leveled her moods. Lena well remembered her grandma's wit and elegance, but Eva's sharpest memory of Bibi was the time Eva fell smack down on the sidewalk outside her grandparents' house. Beatrice was watching the girls, but numbed out on Mother's little helper. When Eva fell, bloodying her face and knocking out a front tooth, Beatrice ran through the front door and halfway down the walkway toward her granddaughter, only to stop still in her tracks. She stood there as Eva screamed and blood ran down her chin, and when the child ran to her, Beatrice backed away in fear. She did wipe off Eva's face and even kissed her once inside the kitchen, but Eva saw the look of disgust first on Beatrice's face. She could never forget that, or how she felt when she went to live with Poppy and Bibi as a teen, and still found no warmth, no connection with her grandmother. Eva knew it was Bibi's idea to send her away at 15 to boarding school. She could never forgive Beatrice for loving one granddaughter more than the other, and it made Eva that much more fiercely defensive of Poppy for trying to make up the difference.